Winter had a way of settling heavy over Willow Creek, pressing into the bones of anyone who lived there. For Clara Whitmore, the cold didn't just seep into the cracks of the cabin, it lived in her chest, a constant ache that no fire could chase away. It had been 6 months since her husband, Thomas, passed from a fever that swept the valley, taking strong men and fragile hopes with equal cruelty. Clara had survived, but surviving was far from living. Each morning she woke with the same questions. How will I protect Eli today? How much longer can I hold everything together? Her son, Eli, only 6 years old, didn't understand the weight of the world pressing on his mother's shoulders. He saw the frost on the windows as something magical, not threatening. He saw each sunrise as a promise, not another trial. Clara envied him for it, but she also feared that innocence wouldn't last. Their land just a humble patch of earth with a weather-worn cabin. A few chickens and an old barn had belonged to Thomas' family. But the man who held the deed now, their landlord Mr. Gregson, wasn't a kind soul. When Thomas died, Gregson had offered his condolences with the same tone he used when discussing harvest yields. And now, with winter tightening its grip, he'd come knocking again, this time with an ultimatum. A woman alone can't manage this land, he had said, his voice dripping with false pity. It's unsafe, unprofitable, impractical. Either you find someone to help you through the winter, or I'll have no choice but to lease the property to someone more capable. Clara had stood on the porch, clutching Eli to her side, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She wanted to scream, to remind Gregson that she had kept the land running this far, that she'd grown up working fields and feeding livestock long before Thomas came into her life. But she knew his mind was already made up. He wasn't challenging her strength. He was counting on her desperation. She didn't have family to run to. Her parents had died years ago. Her sister lived 3 states away with a family of her own, barely able to support herself. There was no one left but Clara and her young son, whose small hands had become clumsy with the chores he tried so hard to help with. The truth was brutal. Without help, she would lose everything within weeks. That night, after Eli had fallen asleep clutching the wooden horse Thomas had carved for him, Clara sat at the table with her head in her hands. The lantern flickered beside her, shadows trembling across the walls. She made lists in her mind, possible help. Men in town she could hire for a few days at a time. Neighbors she could ask for favors, but the same problems remained. She had no money to pay anyone, and no man in Willow Creek would move on to a widow-esque property for the winter without expecting something in return, something she could never give. When the tears finally came, they were silent. She didn't want Eli to hear. She didn't want him to know how close their world was to collapsing. But desperation had a way of carving new paths through the heart. And the next morning, when Clara woke with frost clinging to the window panes and fear tightening her throat, she realized this wasn't a problem she could outrun or endure. She needed help, real help. Even if it meant seeking out the one man in the valley everyone avoided, the reclusive lumberjack hidden deep within the pine forest. Deep in the northern stretch of Willow Creek, where the pine trees grew so tall their tops became lost in morning fog, lived a man most of the town had chosen to forget. Caleb Hunter wasn't unfriendly, exactly. He simply existed on the edges, quiet, steady, and unreachable, like a mountain stone shaped by decades of winter storms. Folks whispered stories about him, each more dramatic than the last. That he'd once killed a man with his bare hands, that he talked to wolves, that he could vanish into the forest like a ghost. Children dared each other to walk as far as the Hunter cabin, but none ever did. The truth was far simpler and far sadder. Caleb lived alone because it hurt too much to live any other way. His cabin sat beside a narrow stream, its logs darkened by weather and time. Smoke curled only occasionally from the chimney, mostly when the winters became so cruel, even a man used to the cold needed warmth to keep death from creeping too close. The forest around him was his companion, the creaking of branches in wind, the soft rush of the stream, the muffled thud of his axe-splitting pine. He preferred the sound of wood breaking to the sound of human voices. There had been a time he wasn't alone, a time when laughter had filled the cabin, when two voices hummed in harmony during long winter nights. His wife, Lila, had brought color into his world, tending flowers outside the cabin windows red, yellow, soft blue. Flowers Caleb hadn't seen since the night the storm took her. The avalanche had come without warning, sweeping down the mountain like the wrath of God. Caleb had survived. Lila had not. And something inside him had been buried with her. Ever since, solitude had become his shield, his punishment, and his comfort. He took logging contracts no one else wanted, felling trees deep in the woods, hauling timber alone, repairing the old mill machinery with quiet competence. People respected him because he worked hard. They avoided him because he never asked for help, never sought company, and never smiled unless he forgot himself. The only creature he trusted was his old dog, Ranger, who limped from an injury years back but still followed Caleb as if the world began and ended with him. Ranger was the one living soul Caleb allowed into his grief. Together they moved through the forest like a pair bound by hidden wounds. But even the forest, loyal as it was, could not protect him from the loneliness that settled like snow inside his heart. Caleb had grown comfortable with silence, yet something in him stirred sometimes soft, brief pangs he ignored. He would watch the horizon at sunset and wonder what it felt like to speak to another person without feeling broken. He would pass families on the rare days he came into town and quickly look away, because the sight of children running free with laughter sharp as sunlight reopened wounds he preferred to keep buried. People didn't know his story. They didn't need to. They only knew he didn't bother anyone and didn't want to be bothered. But fate had a way of stepping into the lives of those who wanted peace the most. And the day Clara Whitmore's wagon wheel snapped outside his property and she stumbled into his clearing with her wide, worried eyes and a child clutching her skirts, Caleb's life, so carefully quiet, shifted. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her sorrow. He only knew that something in her expression pulled him out of his solitude in a way no one had in years. Soon, he would learn that destiny wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. The morning Clara's wagon wheel broke, the sky was a pale winter blue, the kind that made the cold look deceptively gentle. She had hitched her old mare Daisy before dawn, hoping to reach the general store in town before the road iced over. They were halfway through the stretch of forest that bordered Caleb Hunter's land when the wagon jerked violently to one side. A sharp crack split the air. The wheels splintered beneath them. Clara grabbed the sideboard to steady herself as the wagon lurched and tilted. Eli let out a startled cry, clutching her skirt with both hands. Daisy snorted, stamping her hooves nervously on the frozen path. Clara's heart sank. Not here. Not now. This part of the forest was isolated, too far to walk back, too far to go forward, and far too cold to stand around waiting for a miracle. She climbed down, her breath puffing white clouds, and examined the damage. The wheel was not just cracked. It was nearly split in half. Repairing it would take tools she didn't have and skill she didn't possess. Eli tugged on her coat. "Ma, what do we do?" Clara swallowed the panic rising in her throat. "We stay calm," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his cheek. "We look for help." But the forest felt vast and empty. The silence pressed close, broken only by the distant rush of a stream and the creaking branches overhead. She wrapped her shawl tighter and scanned the snow-covered tree line for any sign of a cabin or a miracle. It came in the form of a dog. A large, aging hound with a grizzled muzzle stepped into the path, tail wagging once, cautiously. Eli gasped and knelt in the snow, reaching out his hand. "Hi, boy," he whispered. The dog sniffed him, then licked his mitten. And behind the dog, emerging from the forest shadows, was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, silent as the snow beneath his boots. His dark coat blended with the pine bark behind him, and his beard, thick and untrimmed, made his expression unreadable. Strands of black hair fell across his forehead as he walked, each movement purposeful and solid. Clara froze. She knew who he was. Everybody in Willow Creek knew, at least, they knew the myths. Caleb Hunter, the man who lived alone. The man no one approached. Eli looked up at him with wide, unafraid eyes. "Is this your dog?" Caleb stopped a few paces away, his gaze shifting briefly from the boy to Clara, then to the broken wagon wheel. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like stone scraping wood from years of disuse. "His name is Ranger." Clara felt a tremor of relief and fear all at once. She nodded, gripping her hands together to keep from shivering. I'm sorry if we've wandered onto your land, our wheel. It broke, and I didn't know where else to. You hurt." Caleb interrupted, expression unreadable. "No, just stranded." He studied the wagon with a craftsman's eye. No judgment, no annoyance, only practicality. Then he set his axe against a tree and knelt beside the wheel, running his fingers along the brake. "I can fix it," he muttered. Clara blinked. "Truly?" I don't have money to pay you." He didn't look up. "Didn't ask for money." Eli grinned at his mother, hope warming his face like sunlight. For a moment, Clara felt her chest loosen, just a fraction. Caleb stood slowly. "My cabin's close. I'll bring what I need." And without waiting for permission or thanks, he disappeared into the trees with Ranger trotting at his heels. Clara watched him go, her breath catching. She didn't know why a man like Caleb would help a woman he'd never spoken to. She didn't know why his presence, quiet as it was, made her feel strangely safer. But she sensed, without understanding how, that this encounter was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. The wagon repair should have been the end of it, Clara knew that. Caleb Hunter was not the kind of man you bothered twice. Even as he returned from his cabin with tools slung over his shoulder, she sensed the invisible distance he kept between himself and the world. He knelt by the wagon, working with a silent efficiency that left Clara both grateful and oddly overwhelmed. The rhythm of his movements steady, precise, made it clear he'd fixed far worse than a broken wheel. Eli hovered nearby, entranced, occasionally offering Caleb a nail or a wedge of wood. Caleb accepted each item without a word, giving the boy a faint nod that made Eli straighten with pride. Clara watched all this with a strange tug in her chest. She wasn't used to someone stepping in so easily, so naturally, without expecting anything in return. When the wheel was secured, Caleb stood, wiping his hands on his coat. "You'll make it to town now," he said, barely meeting her gaze. "Keep to the southern path. Less ice." Clara thanked him more than once, but he only shrugged, calling Ranger to his side. He turned back toward the woods, already half swallowed by the shadows. That should have been the end. But fate had other plans. 3 days later, Mr. Gregson came again. He didn't bother knocking. Clara was inside sewing patches onto Eli's coat when the door burst open, letting in a gust of icy wind and the landlord's sour expression. "Well?" he demanded. "Where's the man who's supposed to be helping you this winter?" Clara stiffened. "I told you, I'm doing my best." "Your best isn't enough," Gregson snapped. "This property needs a capable man. I'll give you 2 weeks to prove you have someone here permanently. Otherwise, I reclaim the land." Eli, frightened, crawled behind his mother's chair. Clara's voice wavered. "Why are you doing this?" "The rent is paid until spring." Gregson leaned closer, his words cold as the wind. "Because a widow alone is vulnerable. And vulnerable people make mistakes. I'd hate for something unfortunate to happen in the dead of winter." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. When he left, Clara stood trembling, her hands shaking so hard she dropped her needle. She sank into a chair, covering her face as Eli climbed into her lap. "Ma," he whispered softly, "what are we gonna do?" Clara pressed her lips to his hair, her heart breaking. "I don't know, sweetheart." But as the hours passed and the fire crackled low, a single name kept echoing in her mind: Caleb Hunter. A man who lived alone. A man nobody questioned. A man who could protect them if only for a time. It was absurd, reckless, desperate. But desperation had become her shadow. That evening, with Eli bundled in blankets on her back and the final light fading from the sky, Clara made her way into the forest. Each crunch of snow beneath her boots felt like a step toward either salvation or ruin. Ranger spotted her first, emerging from the trees with a soft bark. Seconds later, Caleb appeared behind him, axe in hand, his expression hardening the moment he recognized her. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, voice low. "It'll drop below freezing soon." "I know." She swallowed, nerves tightening her throat. I needed to speak with you." His gaze flicked to Eli, then back to her. "Is something wrong?" Clara hesitated. This was madness, but if she didn't ask, she would lose everything. Taking a shaky breath, she lifted her chin and forced the words out. "Caleb," she whispered, "I need your help. I need someone to stay on the property this winter. Someone the landlord won't question." His brows knit together. "What kind of help?" Her heart pounded painfully. "Can you?" She bit her lip. "Can you pretend to be my son's father just until spring?" The forest went silent. Caleb stared at her as if she'd spoken in some foreign language. And in that moment, standing beneath the frozen pines, breath trembling in the cold, Clara realized exactly how bold, how impossible, and how heartbreaking her request truly was. For a long moment after Clara's trembling words faded into the cold forest air, Caleb didn't speak. He didn't move. His breath came out in slow, visible clouds, and his eyes, usually unreadable, held something dangerously close to shock. Clara felt her courage draining by the second. "I know it's a lot to ask," she rushed out, hugging Eli closer. "And I know you don't owe us anything. But I am out of options, Caleb. If I lose the land, I lose our home. Eli loses everything he's known." Caleb looked at the boy nestled under her shawl, his small fingers clinging to his mother's coat. Eli's brown eyes, wide and trusting, studied him without fear. Then he lifted one mittened hand in a tiny wave. "Hi, Mr. Caleb." Something in Caleb's chest tightened unexpectedly, painfully like a stitch snapping. He forced his gaze away. "Clara, this isn't something you can just ask a stranger." "I wouldn't," she whispered. "Not unless I had no choice." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it again. His jaw tightened. His life had been built on silence and avoidance walls erected high and thick. He had gotten good at pushing people away before they got close enough to break him again. But Clara wasn't trying to break him. She was standing in front of him, shaking from fear and cold, choosing humiliation over pride because her child needed her to. And that more than anything pierced through Caleb's defenses. He looked at the forest floor, at his own boots buried in snow, at anything except her pleading eyes. "What exactly are you asking?" he finally muttered. Clara took a breath. "For you to stay on the property during the winter. The landlord won't question anything if he sees a man there. And if anyone asks—" Her voice faltered with embarrassment. "You just say you're Eli's father." Caleb rubbed a hand across his beard, exhaling roughly. "That's more than pretending," he said quietly. "People talk in town. Once you say something like that, you don't get to snatch it back." "I know," she whispered. "But if I don't do something, I lose my home." Her voice broke. "I lose him." Eli tightened his grip around her neck, sensing her distress. Caleb watched the movement, small, instinctive, full of trust, and something melted inside him with slow, painful inevitability. He remembered another pair of small hands, another soft voice, another life he failed to protect. He swallowed hard. "It's only until spring? Yes, Clara said. After that, you're free to go. He stared at her, at the hope fighting with fear in her eyes. She expected him to say no. Everyone always expected Caleb Hunter to say no. That was the safest answer. The simplest one, the one that kept his world small and quiet. But he heard Lila's voice in the back of his mind, soft, warm, full of the kindness he'd never managed to forget. Help them, Caleb. You can't live alone forever. Not like this. He let out a slow breath. All right, he said. Clara blinked, stunned. You? You'll do it? He nodded once, stiff but sure. I'll stay. I'll help. And if anyone asks... He glanced at Eli, then back at Clara. I'll say I'm the boy's father. Eli beamed as if someone had handed him the moon. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow this time, but relief so fierce it nearly buckled her knees. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb, truly. Thank you. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with gratitude. I'll come tomorrow morning. Need to pack a few things. Clara nodded, her breath shaking. We'll be ready. As she walked back through the trees, Eli humming softly on her back, Caleb stood frozen in the clearing long after she disappeared. He had said yes. To living among people again. To stepping into another man's place, to becoming the shadow of a family he didn't deserve. The forest felt quieter than usual. Caleb wasn't sure if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, or the choice that would finally lead him out of the lonely darkness he'd lived in for years. Caleb arrived at Clara's homestead the next morning just after sunrise, carrying a small bundle of belongings over one shoulder and Ranger trotting faithfully at his heels. He had expected to feel awkward, out of place like an intruder stepping into a life that did not belong to him. And he did. But something else stirred in him too, something quieter, unfamiliar, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before the avalanche. Clara met him at the door, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes still carrying the remnants of last night's anxiety. When she opened the door wider, letting the warm air spill out into the cold morning, Caleb noticed something new in her expression, cautious hope. We set up a space for you in the spare room, she said softly. I know it's small. He shook his head. Small's fine. Inside, Eli was already waiting, bouncing on his toes with excitement. You came. I told Ma you would, he exclaimed, grabbing Ranger's ears and laughing when the old dog wagged his tail. Caleb felt his heart twist. When was the last time a child had been this happy to see him? Or anyone? Clara guided him to the small room off the kitchen. A simple bed, a wooden chest. A rug that had clearly been repaired many times. Caleb set his bundle down. It didn't take long. He hadn't brought much. You sure you're all right with this? Clara asked gently from the doorway, her fingers nervously twisting in her skirt. Caleb met her eyes, a brief, steady glance. I said I'd help, he replied simply. I don't break my word. Something in her softened at that. The first days passed in quiet awkwardness, but also in unexpected harmony. Caleb spent mornings chopping firewood, hauling water, and reinforcing the barn walls against the coming storms. Clara cooked and cleaned, often peeking out the window to check on him, sometimes out of gratitude, sometimes out of wonder. Eli followed Caleb everywhere he went. Can I help? What's that tool for? Can you show me again? At first Caleb answered with mumbled one-word replies. But gradually, as the days settled into rhythm, his tone warmed. He explained how to stack kindling so it caught fire right, how to tie a proper knot, how to sand a piece of wood so smooth it felt like river stone. One afternoon, Eli held up a small wooden figurine Caleb had carved for him, a little bear with charmingly uneven ears. Did you make this? He asked, awe in his voice. Caleb shrugged, embarrassed. Just something to keep your hands busy. Clara watched from the doorway, her chest tight with emotion. It was the first time she had seen Eli smile like that in months. Not the forced, brave smile he wore for her, but a true one. A child's smile. And Caleb, he looked different too. The sharp lines of grief around his eyes seemed softer. His shoulders, once tense as coiled rope, had relaxed. He didn't talk much, but he no longer seemed haunted by silence. Sometimes when Eli made a silly joke or Clara burned a loaf of bread and pretended she meant to make it that way, Caleb's mouth would twitch upward, almost a smile. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire. Clara read aloud from the few books she owned. Eli leaned against Caleb's side, half asleep, Ranger curled at his feet. Caleb never pushed the boy away. Clara would glance at them both, warmth filling her chest, though she tried not to show it. She reminded herself this was a temporary arrangement just until spring. No reason to let her heart get involved. But hearts rarely listen to reason, and though Caleb remained quiet, reserved, carrying shadows she couldn't yet name, she felt something shifting in the cabin, gentle, fragile, precious, like a family slowly forming. One small moment at a time. Winter deepened like a tightening fist around Willow Creek. Snow piled against fences, winds howled like restless spirits, and the creek behind Clara's cabin froze solid. Inside, however, life had settled into a quiet, warming rhythm, one that felt startlingly close to peace. But peace rarely lasts long for people who've already lost so much. It began with Gregson, the landlord. He arrived unannounced one icy morning just as Caleb was chopping wood behind the barn. Clara was kneading bread when she heard the voice she now dreaded more than the wind. "Well, well?" Gregson drawled, stepping into the yard. "Looks like you actually found yourself a man." Clara stiffened. "Mr. Gregson, this is Caleb Hunter. He lives here now." Gregson's eyes flicked toward Caleb, who straightened slowly, axe balanced casually over one shoulder. Though Caleb said nothing, the weight of his stare was enough to make even a man like Gregson pause. The landlord adjusted his coat, forcing a smug smile back onto his face. "Convenient timing," he said. "But you'll understand if I need proof." "Lots of folks claim things that aren't true." Clara's stomach twisted. She had been expecting this, but not this soon. "Proof?" she echoed quietly. "Of what?" "That he's really the boy's father," Gregson said, nodding toward Eli, who had stepped onto the porch with Ranger beside him. Before Clara could respond, Caleb came forward, placing himself between her and Gregson, not aggressively, but with unmistakable protectiveness. "That's none of your business," Caleb said, voice calm and deep. Gregson smirked. "It is if it concerns my land." Caleb didn't blink. "The boy's mine. And I live here now. That's all you need to know." Gregson's smile faltered. For a moment he studied them, Caleb's imposing figure, Clara's trembling hands, Eli pressing close to Caleb's coat. The picture painted itself easily enough for town gossip to swallow. "Fine," Gregson said finally. "But I'll be watching." He tipped his hat with mocking politeness and stomped back to his wagon. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Caleb glanced down at her. "You okay?" She nodded, though her hand still shook faintly. "Thank you." "I didn't expect him today," Caleb grunted. "He won't bother you when I'm around." But Gregson wasn't the only threat winter dragged to their doorstep. 3 days later, another man rode into the clearing, this one younger, leaner, and carrying an arrogance that set Clara's nerves on edge the moment she saw him. Daniel Whitmore, her late husband's estranged brother. Clara's blood ran cold. Daniel dismounted, dusting snow from his jacket. "Sister-in-law," he greeted, though the title was coded in something sour. "Heard Tom passed. Thought I'd stop by, see how things turned out." Clara forced herself to stand tall. "What do you want, Daniel?" He shrugged lazily. "Came to collect what's mine. This land belongs to the Whitmore family. Tom's gone. I'm next of kin." Clara felt nausea twist in her stomach. "You abandoned Tom years ago." "You have no claim," Daniel cut her off. "Law might say otherwise." and the law tends to listen to men." Eli whimpered and hid behind Clara's skirt. Caleb stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Clara," he said quietly, "everything all right?" Daniel turned, eyes narrowing. "And who the hell is this?" "My name's Caleb Hunter," he replied calmly. "And this is my family." Clara's breath caught. Family. He said it without hesitation, without glancing at her for approval. The word hung warm and heavy in the cold air. Daniel scoffed. "Funny, Tom never mentioned a brother." Caleb stepped closer. "I'm not his brother." "Then you've got no claim here either." Caleb's eyes hardened. "I have a claim to them." Daniel took a step back, not because Caleb threatened him, but because something in Caleb's presence made threats feel unwise. "This isn't over," Daniel snapped, retreating toward his horse. "I'll be back with papers." Clara's knees threatened to buckle. Caleb placed a steady hand on her arm. "He won't take you home," he said quietly. But Clara wasn't worried about the land. She was worried about Eli, because Daniel hadn't just said papers. He had said family, and that meant he was coming for the boy. The mountain air that evening felt colder than usual, sharp enough to sting the lungs and heavy enough to settle on the soul. Elias had worked himself to exhaustion again, splitting logs long after the sun had vanished behind the pines. Lydia watched from the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, wondering how a man could look both so strong and so defeated. It had been nearly a month since Elias agreed to pretend to be Henry's father. What had started as a practical arrangement, a desperate mother seeking protection, a lonely lumberjack seeking purpose, had quietly grown into something dense and unspoken, something neither of them dared to name. But that night, everything seemed to crack. Henry was asleep inside, curled up with his handmade wooden horse. Lydia stepped down from the porch and made her way toward the chopping block. Elias didn't notice her at first. His hat was low, his breaths ragged, his axe sinking deeper and deeper into the wood as if he were trying to split the earth itself. "Elias," she said softly. He froze at the sound of her voice. Slowly he set the axe aside and straightened. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat despite the cold. His jaw was tight, his eyes troubled. "You should be resting," Lydia said, searching his face for the reason behind this storm brewing inside him. "Couldn't sleep," he muttered. "Figured I'd keep busy." She stepped closer. "You've been keeping busy every night this week." He gave a hollow laugh. "Noticed that, huh?" "Anyone would." She hesitated, then whispered, "Elias, what's wrong?" For a moment, it looked as though he wouldn't answer. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath, and then, almost reluctantly, he met her gaze. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said quietly. The words hit her like a blow. "Leaving?" Elias looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "I came here to help, and I've done that. Henry's safe. The farm's standing. You two don't need me anymore." "That's not true." Lydia's voice trembled. "It is," he insisted. "And I can't stay where I don't belong." There was the truth, sharp and painful. Lydia swallowed hard, trying to find her voice through the sudden panic rising in her chest. "Is this about the sheriff?" she asked. Sheriff Cole had visited again, suspicious of the new husband, asking questions neither of them liked answering. "No," Elias said. "Not him." "Then what?" He finally looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw heartbreak she didn't understand. "Because every day I stay, it feels less like pretending," he whispered. "And that's dangerous." Lydia's breath caught. Dangerous. Because he was falling for her? Or because he feared she could never feel the same? She stepped closer, their breath mingling in the cold air. "Elias, you're part of this family. Henry adores you." "I," her voice faltered. The words felt heavy, fragile, terrifying to say. He shook his head, stepping back as though her nearness burned. "Don't say things you don't mean, Lydia." "I do mean them." Elias looked torn, as though standing at the edge of a cliff. You lost your husband. You're scared. Meeting someone doesn't mean. It means something, she said fiercely. Silence stretched between them, thick and aching. Finally, Elias whispered, If I stay, I need to know it's because you truly want me here. Not for protection. Not for Henry, for you. Lydia opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Henry's frightened cry echoed from inside the cabin, shattering the moment. Elias tensed. Lydia gasped. And just like that, the truth stayed unspoken, hanging in the cold night air as both of them ran toward the child who had brought them together. Winter was retreating, but the threats looming over Clara and Eli's lives hadn't gone away. Daniel Whitmore's intermittent visits, Gregson's suspicious eyes, and the small-town whispers created a tense pressure that never quite lifted. Caleb had tried to shield them, his presence alone a barrier. But the weight of pretense, the one he had agreed to endure months ago, was becoming unbearable. It began one chilly afternoon when Daniel returned, armed this time not just with threats, but legal papers. Clara had been tending the small vegetable patch near the barn, the first green shoots daring to break through the melting snow when the distant sound of hooves made her heart race. She recognized Daniel instantly. He was riding with confidence, arrogance written in every movement, and the glint of ink documents in his hand made her stomach tighten. Clara, Daniel called, dismounting with a theatrical flourish, we need to finalize the property transfer. These papers are your family's future or lack thereof. Clara swallowed, gripping her shawl tighter around Eli, who peeked from behind her skirts. She had hoped that Caleb's role as father would deter him. But Daniel seemed undeterred, arrogance sparkling in his eyes. Before she could respond, Caleb stepped out from the shadow of the barn. He had been inspecting the roof after the recent snowstorm, but the moment he saw Daniel, his broad shoulders squared. There was a quiet authority about him that made even the brash Daniel pause. Caleb's voice was steady, low, and unmistakable. Step back, Daniel. This family isn't yours to take. Daniel sneered. And who are you? Some hired hand pretending to be a father? Caleb's jaw tightened. The moment of silence that followed was heavier than any words. Then, in a deliberate, calm voice, he said something that shocked Clara almost as much as Daniel. I am Eli's father. Clara froze. She knew Caleb was bluffing, that he was only protecting them, but the firmness in his voice, the unwavering gaze into Daniel's eyes, left no room for doubt. Daniel's smug confidence faltered, his sneer replaced by confusion. What nonsense is this? Daniel demanded. He's a stranger. He may be a stranger by blood, Caleb admitted, but he's not a stranger by heart. He has protected this boy, kept this home intact, and stood between you and anyone who'd harm them. That makes him family, by right if not by name. Clara's heart raced. Her eyes filled with tears, not fear this time, but relief, pride, and something she hadn't admitted to herself, love. Caleb's bold declaration wasn't just a shield. It was the truth of how he had become their protector, their anchor, their family. Daniel's jaw tightened, realizing that the law might not side with a literal claim, but the town, the neighbors, and even the sheriff were watching. Caleb had taken the moral high ground, and it was undeniable. You can't, Daniel started, but Caleb cut him off. I can, and I will. These people are my family. Threaten them again, and you'll answer to me. Daniel, realizing that resistance was futile, slammed the papers into his saddlebag, muttering darkly before mounting his horse and riding off. The snow swallowed the sound of hooves, leaving an eerie silence behind. Clara moved forward, placing her hand on Caleb's arm. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Caleb's expression softened for the first time in weeks. You don't have to say anything. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was the right thing. Eli peeked around Caleb's legs, his small voice full of wonder. "You're really my dad?" Caleb knelt slowly, meeting his eyes. "I am now, kid, if you'll have me." In that moment all the pretense, all the worry, all the months of guarded hearts dissolved. The truth had finally emerged, raw and undeniable. Caleb wasn't just pretending anymore. He was their family. And for Clara, that meant hope, not just for the land, not just for winter, but for the life they could finally begin to imagine together. Spring arrived slowly in Willow Creek, brushing the trees with faint green and melting the last stubborn patches of snow. The creek's icy crust had thawed, flowing freely once again, carrying with it the sounds of returning life. Birds singing, frogs croaking, and the gentle rush of water over rocks. For Clara, Eli, and Caleb, it was more than the changing season. It was the dawn of something they hadn't dared to hope for, a real permanent family. The legal threats were finally resolved. Daniel Whitmore had retreated, begrudgingly recognizing that the Whitmore estate was no longer his concern, while Gregson had been satisfied with the appearances Caleb had maintained as Eli's father. No papers could make a family, and yet, for once, the law and town gossip aligned with their truth. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the hearth reflected a deeper warmth in their hearts. Clara moved about, preparing breakfast while Caleb and Eli stacked firewood outside, laughing when a misthrown log tumbled sideways. The sound of Eli's laughter, the pure, unguarded joy of a child, was a melody Caleb had not realized he'd been missing for so long. "Careful, Eli," Caleb called, though a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "That log's bigger than you are." Eli grinned, shrugging as if to say, "Maybe it is, but that won't stop me." Clara paused at the doorway, watching them. Her heart swelled in a way that frightened her. So much love, so much relief, so much belonging. For months, she had feared the worst. Losing her land, losing Eli, losing hope. But Caleb had become more than a guardian. He had become their family. And as she looked at him, she felt a deep, quiet certainty that this was exactly where he was meant to be. After breakfast, Caleb took Eli by the hand and led him to the barn, showing him how to tend to the animals that had been cooped up all winter. Clara followed, carrying a basket of eggs, her eyes catching Caleb's subtle interactions with her son. The gentle touch on his shoulder, the patient correction when Eli's eagerness overran him, the soft laugh at his mistakes. It was a rhythm of life neither of them had expected. Yet each action, each glance, each shared smile built a foundation stronger than wood or stone. Later, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting golden light through the tall pines, Caleb and Clara found themselves alone on the porch. Ellie had gone inside to fetch Ranger, who had sprawled near the hearth after a long day. Clara's hands found Caleb's, almost instinctively. I'm grateful," she said softly. "Not just for helping us, but for staying." Caleb's gaze met hers. For a moment, the stoic mask he always wore slipped, revealing something raw, honest, and unguarded. "I stayed because it felt right, because I can't imagine not being here now." Her breath caught. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. And the unspoken words between them, years of grief, loneliness, fear, and hope, found their voice in that quiet understanding. Eli ran out, holding Ranger's leash, breaking the intimate moment, but they didn't pull away. Instead, they watched their son play, knowing that what they had built was real. No pretense. No half measures. Just a family imperfect, strong, and enduring. That night, as Caleb tucked Eli into bed, the boy clutched the wooden bear Caleb had carved months before. "You're really my dad now," he whispered sleepily. Caleb's eyes softened. "Yes, kid. Really your dad." Clara watched from the doorway, tears glistening in her eyes. She realized that home wasn't just a place. It was these moments, these bonds, this love that had grown in the cold and flourished with warmth. Outside, the creek gurgled, the forest breathed, and the mountains stood silent witness. Within the cabin, the hearth glowed, laughter echoed, and three hearts beat in quiet harmony. They were no longer pretending. They were real. They were family. And for the first time in years, all of them, Clara, Eli, and Caleb, felt the kind of peace that only love and belonging can bring.